Hi, I'm Andy Marks of the Centre for Western Sydney. We are here today as part of our Western Sydney Votes series of forums, reports and events. And before I go any further, when we're talking about Western Sydney, I want to acknowledge country and traditional elders past and present and emerging. This is a region that's steeped in millennia of politics, and we shouldn't forget that as we talk about the looming state election on March the 25th. Western Sydney will dominate political behaviours and political dialogue in the weeks leading up to the election, and it should, because a third of votes cast in New South Wales come from this region. And that really means that what happens in Western Sydney will have a big bearing on the eventual outcome, whether the coalition get back into office or whether the Labor opposition make it over the line. Now, a discussion on politics with just me alone would be a pretty boring affair. So I've got some friends with me from the Centre for Western Sydney. I have Dr. Rondo Atawi. G'day, Rondo.
Thank you.
And Tom Nance. Hey, Tom. Now we're going to walk through all of the key issues and we'll come back and have a look at some areas in depth as we go on. But Tom, I want to start with the setting politically, what we are confronting as we head towards the polls in Western Sydney. Cost of living probably dominates. What are the other issues that are...
Look, definitely cost of living will be on voters' minds as they go into the polling booths, but also things like infrastructure, particularly transport, health and educational infrastructure is really dominating conversations, as well as issues we didn't necessarily expect would come up. Things like gambling-related harm and electronic gaming machine reform has actually really progressed in an interesting way. And
AKA pokies, right?
AKA pokies.
Yeah,
and
sure.
Look, it's been a really interesting conversation for the region as well around pokies and their place within it.
Yeah. Look, and I think, Rhonda, the other issue that's going to bubble away is very significantly lots of Western Sydney experienced pretty severe lockdowns during the course of the pandemic. How do you think that might impact people's voting?
No doubt the COVID-19 lockdowns and the disproportionate, I'd say, impacts on Western Sydney will be on the minds of voters, and something that would be even changing the way in which communities in Western Sydney think about politics and the ways in which they engage with government and some of the key issues that are facing them. I think one thing we need to bear in mind are some of the anecdotal evidence and some of the discussions around distrust in government that arose particularly in Western Sydney following the COVID-19 lockdowns, but also the ways in which COVID-19 drew attention to the importance of open public space in Western Sydney. You know, being confined to 5 kilometres in radius and not having adequate access to parks and blue spaces compared to other parts of Sydney really highlighted some discrepancies and disparities that will be no doubt at the front of mind in the region.
Yeah, look, I think you're right. I think there's a heightened political consciousness. And I think also the fact that we saw integrity and trust feature in the federal election, I think it's something that we might see again prevail at this poll as well. That goes to that question of lived experience. Tom, you talked about cost of living. What does it feel like if you're in Western Sydney?
Look, it's, I guess, you know, to use the metaphor, it's really, it feels like the vice is tightening for families in Western Sydney. When we look at cost of living, it's multifaceted, and Western Sydney do a lot of the heavy lifting when we think about tolls and the disproportionate tolls that Western Sydney people face going from west to east and back again compared to, let's say, north to south from our friends in the North Shore who travel across the Harbour Bridge. It also looks like soaring prices in terms of the Bowser and how that impacts the car-heavy economy. On top of that, energy prices, and considering we've just had a relatively kind but still quite a hot summer in Western Sydney, people will be looking at their bills and wondering how they're going to meet them.
And look, Rhonda, by extension, I think the feeling on the ground for people too would be impacted by the fact that in Western Sydney we have ongoing housing affordability challenges. We have an increase in homelessness, particularly among older women. What kind of issues do you think will play out in terms of decision making at the election?
Yeah, so I think that the census really pointed some key issues around income inequity and how that might be contributing to issues of homelessness. When we look at the gender dimensions of income inequity between Western Sydney and Eastern Sydney, we see women in Western Sydney are earning less than women in other parts of Sydney. So the labour force participation of Western Sydney women should be at the forefront of the agenda, and in ensuring that we are shaping policies that take into account the gendered impacts of income inequity and ensuring that we're empowering women to participate in the workforce and therefore prevent these issues of homelessness that are arising in this context.
Now, that leads me on to, I think, before we get on to a bit of seat-by-seat analysis, Tom, women's participation in the workforce. I mean, Matt Keane, the Treasurer, hung his hat on that. Very big statement about that in the budget. And Labor's been very much about doing rather than committing. The fact that they have a very significant representation of women in their shadow cabinet compared to the coalition, they're all factors. How do you think that's going to play out?
It's a tough one because it's a multifaceted issue when we look at women's participation in the workforce in Western Sydney versus the rest of Sydney. We look at rates of unpaid care. And not only do women in Western Sydney provide more unpaid care than their counterparts in the rest of Sydney, there's a real clear gender gap between the proportion of men who are providing unpaid care versus women who are providing unpaid care.
Now, that speaks to something, Rhonda, that you rose, I think, in your report around budget time last year. We talked about unpaid care. What else can we say on that particular issue?
Yep, so as Tom mentioned, there is a gender discrepancy in who's providing unpaid care, but if we compare it between Western Sydney and the rest of Sydney, women in Western Sydney are providing more unpaid care than women in the rest of Sydney. So the impacts of this gender dimension in providing care and how it affects income levels, long-term superannuation, this is more greatly affected and felt in Western Sydney.
So that means that the really tuned-in voter impacted by those issues is going to look at things like the prevalence of care and the way the care economy is treated, etc., flexibility in work. So it's not just an economic or straight-out labour market question, it's about all those other things.
Absolutely. And I think that the COVID-19 context in changing the way people work has really brought these questions to the forefront in people's mind. And this will be the first election we have following these lockdowns, following this context, and I think it'll bring out some of these key questions will start to resonate in those voting patterns.
Okay. Now, given the subject matter we've covered already, it seems a little strange to me, Tom, that in the pre-selection shenanigans and in the kind of jostling for candidates, that we're hearing more about factionalism than the issues that you and Rhonda have raised. So give us a quick overview, if you can be quick, on the changing of the guard, who's out, who's in, and then we'll get onto that issue around, we call it Squid Games, but we can call it pre-selection games.
Yeah, we can call it the pre-selection games or the Hunger Games even.
Yes, so what are the players up to? What's happening?
There's a clear changing of the guard, particularly for the Liberal Party. In New South Wales and in Greater Sydney. Where we see it in Western Sydney is key leaders and senior figures like David Elliott, like Jeff Lee, are retiring, as well as, across the ditch.
One of them voluntarily, but maybe the other one maybe not
a bit
so.
less so.
Okay. Yep.
Folks like Victor Dominello and Brad Hazzard as well, the longest serving member in the lower house. And so we've got that context. There's almost this leadership change within the Liberal Party going into this election, which is a challenge in the first place. Add to that the fact that within Western Sydney, within the 5 weeks of the election, there were 11 seats that the Liberal Party hadn't fielded a candidate for yet or hadn't finalised a candidate for. It's a really, tricky thing, especially when you've got candidates coming from a standing start. And Labor have their own issues. Some high-profile, captain's picks that didn't work out so well, as well as not being able to bed down candidates in Cabramatta and in Fairfield, which has led to a lot of rumblings of an independent challenge there.
So this seems a little strange to me, Rhonda, because it seems to suggest that some of the lessons around the Christina Keneally experiment and perhaps not recognising the level of political consciousness in these regions is putting both parties at risk. Would you agree?
Yeah, I'd say so. I think that along with kind of some of the evolving attitudes and perceptions that we're seeing in the region and that increased political consciousness, I think there's a real appetite in the region to have leaders that represent the region itself. And I think that that's something that both governments must consider when selecting leaders to represent the region and to ensure that those leaders do represent the diversity of our region in gender and cultural diversity. These would be key issues on the minds of voters in Western Sydney.
Yeah, and you would hope that could happen without all of this toing and froing.
Yes, that's right.
But Tom, why is it the case that they're not learning the lessons from the federal experience, both sides?
Look, it's a tough one. I think there's an element of that. And when you consider that there's a fixed date of election in New South Wales, everyone knew it was coming. It wasn't like the election needed to be called. It seems mind-boggling, but often when we get down to the seat-by-seat kind of level, there's a lot of personalities at play, which make pre-selecting a candidate a really difficult thing. And as we've seen, sometimes the risk of stepping in as a political leader and making a captain's call is that it can be rejected by the community, like Christina Keneally was, or it can, backfire as it has at this level and this state election.
Yeah, look, it's disappointing for Western Sydney, and whatever your political stripes are, we really want to see, I think, much more focus on grassroots development of candidates for the right reasons, as opposed to who you hang out with. And I'll leave it there. Now, I want to go into some of the issues. We talked a little bit about cost of living, Tom, and you talked about the lived experience of that, and as did you, Rhonda. I want to go on to education and infrastructure. Firstly, onto infrastructure, so roads, rails, etc., everything in between. Gladys Berejiklian went to the last election with perhaps one of the biggest infrastructure pipelines and spends we've seen in state government history. And still, Michael Daly, a late pick for the candidacy for Labor, managed to scrape a bit off the coalition vote in Western Sydney. So it says to you that average voters aren't that impressed necessarily by big infrastructure, and they don't feel perhaps that those things are changing their lives for the better. Would you agree? And if it's not infrastructure, what's this election going to be fought on?
Look, I think the tried and trodden path during an election is to roll out the scissors, roll out the ribbon and cut that in front of a piece of infrastructure, an infrastructure announcement. That's the tried and trodden path. However, as you allude to, the people of Western Sydney are starting to go, that's great, but what does it do for me? What's this piece of infrastructure going to do for me? How's it going to improve my life? And I think that's the big question, why the discussion around infrastructure has moved to schools and how infrastructure keeps pace there, how it moves towards, open space, the blue spaces you referred to. So it's really a question of not necessarily the infrastructure announcement, but how it's going to make a tangible difference for a broad cross-section of the public.
So on that topic, is it about who actually does benefit from this infrastructure? And Rhonda, I want to, get to the people that might be missing out. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we're really seeing the importance of social infrastructure becoming a key concern among communities. And that is, when we have these buildings, what are the programs, what are the activities that are, being undertaken in those spaces or in those buildings? How does it build community? How does it build skills? How does it address education and, skills gaps, for example, that will have tangible impacts on an improved quality of life among communities? So I think that, infrastructure is, of course, great, but how are we embedding infrastructure to improve health outcomes, for example? How are we using, cycleways, green spaces, other forms of infrastructure to enhance, the health outcomes of Western Sydney and address the health inequities?
And I think, Western Sydney doesn't have a shortage of monuments that just sit there. It's a question of activation.
Are you referring to Westfields? Or?
Oh, look, that's the biggest monument we've got, right? Nothing else matters. But it's the question of how do we activate these spaces and make them accessible for the community, not just for people with means, but for all people.
Yeah, that's right. And a little bit of a preview, folks, as well. In the arts and cultural space, Rhonda, I know you've done a lot of work. We have a report coming up soon around the state of the arts in Western Sydney. That would come under that social infrastructure umbrella too, wouldn't it? And what about the inequities we saw there?
Yeah, absolutely. In our consultations with stakeholders within the arts and cultural sector, without giving too much away at this point, the importance of programming and operational support and the social infrastructure that supports some of these upcoming developments through the Western Invest Fund were one of the key issues that emerged within all of the conversations we had in the sector.
So it's, to be, I guess, frank, it's like, thanks for the big kit, but what about the things that actually make it connect into the community?
Yeah, how are we going to keep it going? How are we going to make sure it's sustainable? And how do we ensure that these social and cultural infrastructures are serving the communities that we intend to work with?
Okay. So this is going to, on a related topic, Tom, the current government's been around for, a 12-year stint. Now, with 12 years, you think that you would be able to have that connectedness within government to make sure that when you release new land for development, that you actually ensure that the schools are in place. That's not happening though.
No, it's not. And often what that means is the independent schools often beat the state schools into these new release areas. I mean, it's understandable that residents are frustrated when the McDonald's goes up quicker than their local school, right?
Yep.
But a lot of that's around, the planning legislation and around the apparatus of government and of bureaucracy. We need to really look at, when we're making announcements, when we're releasing land, what is going to enable it at a bureaucratic level? And this isn't something you can necessarily cut a ribbon on.
Yep.
But what's going to make it possible for government to be more agile, and also for government, when it's appropriate, to actually take that step back and offer solutions through partnership, through business and through industry.
So this is I guess the instance where we think, well, what about a little bit of joined up thinking? The Greater Cities Commission is in place to help those things occur and to help with the social infrastructure, black spots, and also to help address shortfalls in schools infrastructure. Is it the case that government's just not using those things effectively?
Yeah, look, I think whoever gets in government after March will need to have a think about how they're leveraging these broad bodies and these broad apparatuses to deliver results, particularly within Western Sydney. I mean, the dilemma is for every, greenfield site that we're growing in, we're also looking at infill development, high density. So there's those parallel conversations about how we plan better in terms of making sure the school comes out to a place like Riverstone or Marsden Park. But also that question about how are we going to cope with the massive growth in population in the Liverpool CBD when it comes to community amenity.
Well, that goes to the point too. One of the great successes we've seen over this last parliamentary period is that rates of higher education attainment in Western Sydney have grown pretty rapidly, Rhonda. To that point around bringing women into the workforce and about ensuring that our wonderfully multiculturally diverse community in Western Sydney also is participating to its full capacity. How do we ensure that happens? Because it's one thing to have access and to have that achievement, but how do we ensure that they actually benefit?
Yeah, I think that the importance of investing in early education and primary, high school education, and the connection between the quality of education received at the lower grades of a child's development and educational development, and how that translates into higher education is a really important gap to address. And if we don't have the schools available in our upcoming areas and areas of development, that's a critical gap that will undermine the ability to really maximise the higher education attainment rates in the region, and to really bring it to even out with the rest of Sydney.
Yeah, look, I think that's the question here is what are we doing with respect to improving people's opportunities in their lives with infrastructure?
And I think to build on that, often the line was trotted out in a previous federal election, what's more aspirational than wanting to own your own home? I think the conversation, particularly in Western Sydney, has changed. Families are actually thinking, and their biggest aspiration is quality education for their children, so they have opportunities.
Is this the new barbecue stopper, Tom Vance?
It is. It is. Definitely. It's that whole question around not owning a new home, but where can my kid go to school to excel?
So very quickly on that point as well. So we do have the new barbecue stopper, and the other question will be, thanks for that. How do we retain and reward good teachers? Now the coalition's come up with a scheme to kind of reward a select few, but they want to keep a cap on wages for teachers. In return, they want to see better productivity more broadly, and before they make a move on that. And we understand that Labor, though, is wanting to favour a dialogue, which is what we see in other states with the public service sector around wages. For teachers who feel undervalued, who feel overburdened, is this going to make the difference? Firstly, I'll hold that thought. Firstly to you, Rhonda.
So I think that the COVID-19 context in particular really shed light on the burnout, the difficulty that teachers faced, and we've seen a drop in rates of teachers remaining in their field. So this is a critical turning point, and if we're acknowledging that teachers feel underpaid, undervalued, and that their work may not be rewarding, considering the amount of time and investment that they put into what they return in a context of a rising cost of living. No doubt this is a priority, and we need to hear from teachers about what they need and ensure that we're meeting those needs in order to retain and actually have a sustainable workforce in the future.
And I know the data's not amazing on this question, but I know that you've pointed in the past to the digital divide, to use
Yes.
the terminology. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think that really did feed into the experience of education during COVID-19.
Yep.
Our former Chancellor, Professor Peter Shergold, released a review back in August last year that found that students in Western Sydney, 1 in 5 of those students did not have access to a digital device to be able to participate in their online learning activities. And the ongoing impacts of that will be felt for many years to come following, the 2 years of lockdowns that those children face. But overall, if we look at the Australian Digital Inclusion Index, we find that key LGAs in Western Sydney have the lowest rates of digital inclusion compared with the rest of Sydney. And it really is demonstrating a digital divide in access to devices, the ability to use those devices, and an affordability issue. And it's something that we really need to examine more deeply in Western Sydney in the context of education, but overall, how this digital divide will be undermining the future economic success of the region.
I think you've hit on the real sleeper issue for Western Sydney, and in fact, if the exercise today was to understand the motivations of people when they go to the ballot box, I think that's going to be a big one. Before I leave off on teachers, Tom, should we go the route of supporting the elite teaching few to lift the rest of the profession up, or should we have a dialogue?
So look, I'm married to a teacher, and that's reward enough for her, I'm sure. But between that aside, I mean, the really tricky thing is that there are loads of different ways that we're talking about retaining teachers. 1 in 9 teachers. We're losing 1 in 9 teachers.
1 in 9 go in the first 5 years of their career.
And that's huge, right? We know we're dealing with staffing shortages, and it's a system that's really starting to break down. And I hear about it every day. And the tricky thing is there's no one answer. There's a lot of teachers who are there for the love of it, but still need to pay their bills. And I think one thing that sits across a lot of teacher feedback, which both the Coalition and Labor are looking at, is that teachers get in the field to teach, not to do administration. And more there's an administrative burden, which means teachers are up late at night, which means teachers are doing more than they ever have done before. That is just making it extremely untenable. And I know from all the nights that my wife's been huddled over the laptop, entering data and doing all those kind of things. It's a really tricky sell when that's dragging you away from what you're really passionate about doing. But also it's dragging you away from your life, from your kids, from your family. It's a really tricky one to reconcile.
Okay, and look, I can only extend our gratitude to your wife for what she does, but the extreme burden of putting up with you is something altogether different. Now, I want to get on to a bit of a tour of some of the key issues. I just want to finish on health before we start hitting some of the key seats. Health, a long-standing source of inequity in Western Sydney. Yet the government will quite rightly say that they've invested a lot. Close to $1 billion at Nepean. They've invested nearly the same at Westmead. Big investments in hospital infrastructure at Liverpool and Campbelltown. Yet it doesn't seem to be producing the results on the ground, Tom.
No, it's a tough one because you're right. When you look at it on a surface level, record infrastructure investment. However, when you marry that to the rapid growth of Western Sydney, it's that question of, is this investment keeping up with demand, and how do we do that? I think also, and again, we've talked about infrastructure alone isn't enough. There's question marks around both parties' approaches to resourcing in terms of nursing, in terms of doctors, in terms of other, health services. How do we resource health, knowing that, of course, it's, let's put it bluntly, a huge outlay from the state every year in terms of paying for that.
So I'm going to come back to you in a moment on the differences in health outcomes, just a few highlights that are just shocking. But Rhonda, we saw through the lockdown period, the public health messaging was pretty poor, in fact, very poor in some respects. And I think the government would even agree to some communities where really high prevalence of non-English speakers reside. Why aren't we, at this day and age, given that fact, given how much we know about the wonderful diversity we have, why aren't we tailoring messaging better in that space?
I feel like what we saw following, the COVID-19, or during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the ways in which health messaging was approached, is that the government really did take a reactive approach.
Yep.
And in engaging with multicultural communities and culturally and linguistically diverse communities, it would really pay off to take a more proactive approach in learning how to best engage, what forms of communication are most effective, even down to the types of technologies that culturally diverse communities use. I think that the response really demonstrated that there was less understanding than what was required in order to engage in an effective way. So this would require investment in taking a more proactive approach and in really learning from the lesson, taking that key moment and turning it around to taking that more proactive approach and in learning and understanding the best ways to engage with these communities, particularly as our communities become more and more diverse and more multicultural.
So that's a factor too, and I want to explore that it extends beyond periods of public health emergency, right? That's around health literacy in general in Western Sydney, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I think that it's definitely seen across the board, and it would be reflected in some of the health outcomes, I'm sure, that we'll discuss across, across the region.
It would, and thanks, Rhonda. I agree, and you just hope that some of the learnings that occurred there actually put into place, Tom, because it's a pretty dire picture.
Yeah, look, I mean, when you look at the health of Western Sydney residents, it's not great. I mean, highlighting, diabetes, which is a lifestyle illness, and that's a confluence of things. It's not only poor health literacy, but it's also poor walkability. It's the fact that we've got, fresh food deserts across Western Sydney where it's easier to get fast food than it is to get good food.
Yeah.
And so there's that big question in terms of health. When we talk about spending, we're often focusing on infrastructure, on staffing, and on that really pointy end. But there's also the question of preventative and how, particularly around health literacy, we're able to build that. And I mean, as well as that, when we look at Western Sydney, there's significantly higher rates of comorbidity in Western Sydney, and that's a person having 2 or more long-term illnesses. So if you take, for example, diabetes and marry it with heart disease, it then plays out in terms of poor living outcomes, poor employment outcomes, poor income outcomes, and it just perpetuates.
Well, look, I've saved the very best to last. We're going to hit some of the key seats now. We're in the home stretch, but I think that when we understand, as Rhonda's really powerfully illustrated around things at the community level, what's dominating decision making, and as Tom's talked about some of the data around some of the key inequities, you can see how some seats will literally go down to the wire. And Tom's taken a look at a few of them. Do you want to take us through them?
Look, I've slaved away hard on, spreadsheets, electoral data. I got the crayons out and made some maps as well. It was a beautiful experience with my kids. But look, what's really clear is all paths lead to the west. There is not a clear route for victory for either the Liberal Party or the Labor Party without securing key contested seats in Western Sydney. It's as simple as that. Of course, Western Sydney often has the perception that there's rusted on seats, and that's true. There are some seats that are very safe and will be unlikely to move. However, there's probably about 7 seats I'd highlight in particular that are targets for both the Liberal Party and the Labor Party.
Well, let's go through a few, and I'll bring Rhonda in too, so we can comment on some of the issues that are bubbling up. And I want to look at that little cluster of Parramatta and Winston Hills. And Winston Hills just had a rename, right?
Yep. It's rebranded. It's caught up to 2023.
Was it Seven Hills, right?
Yep.
The electorate formerly known as Seven Hills, formerly known as Toongabbie.
Exactly.
Yeah, great. That's my old stomping ground, so I apologise for any generational impact I've had there.
Yep.
But take us through.
So, look, in this electorate, Labor have solved some pre-selection questions by going the tried and tested route of raiding the larder of local government.
Okay.
So in Parramatta, which will be a very interesting contest, we've got the Lord Mayor, Donna Davis from City of Parramatta, running up against the Liberal candidate there. It's a really key seat because there's not only the tactical significance of picking up a seat in Western Sydney, and if Donna Davis is able to do that, that's going to be huge for Labor. There's also a symbolic element of Parramatta and being able to pick that up.
Now, I'm going to go to you in a moment on Parramatta, Rhonda, because we, of course, produced a report through the Centre on Parramatta. But before I do, this is the seat that Dr. Jeff Lee is retiring from.
That's correct. And he was hugely popular at a local level. And I think his retirement has opened up this seat. If he was running again, I think they'd be a lot safer.
They could square this away.
I reckon they'd be able to square that away.
All right, so Parramatta's in play. Parramatta has been the target, or if you like, the source of incredible growth, particularly in its CBD. What are the issues that are bubbling around for Parramatta that we saw in the Parramatta report the Centre produced?
Yep, so I think no doubt we see Parramatta as a real key centre to the development of Greater Sydney and even, you could even argue our state and its connection to some of the other regions. So within our report, we engage in a whole range of themes. But I'm now currently analysing and digging into some of the Parramatta community consultation
So
findings.
you did a lot of consultation. Just
Yep.
take us briefly through that. Who did you talk to?
So we'll flag that the report's coming out in the next month or so. We spoke to a range of community members all across Sydney. We did not restrict our engagement to just the Parramatta area because we really believe that the region is really central to the city and a whole variety of uses. So people might work there, they might live there, they might receive care in Westmead, in some of our a major health precinct in Sydney. So we really engage in the whole cross section of communities.
And what were they saying? What themes emerged?
So some of the things that they loved about Parramatta and things that should be really celebrated and retained in the region was the cultural diversity of that region, the range of dining of options that are affordable, and this is something, the affordability was something that our community members really valued and wanted to retain. And I think that we've already seen in the last few months that affordability in terms of housing and the ability to stay in Parramatta has reduced drastically.
That's a big tension, isn't it?
Yep, and that is a big challenge for the future development of Parramatta. We need to be mindful that we don't exclude and push out the communities that make Parramatta what it is.
So maybe that puts it at a bit more of a tipping point, Tom, because it's got quote unquote growing pains.
It does. And it's definitely a lot of the seats we're looking at in Western Sydney are experiencing those growing pains because you combine, residents who've been there for years and whatnot with different kind of cohorts that are moving in.
So on that topic, I'm going to take us down the road a little bit to Riverstone, an old school electorate, but also the newly established electorate of Leppington.
So when I think about two seats in Western Sydney that really symbolise that rapid growth, it's Riverstone, it's Leppington. Now, Leppington is a potluck, I think, at the moment. It's nominally Labor. However, there has been so much change in terms of personnel coming in that it's anyone's race. And both Leppington and Riverstone are actually grappling with some of those issues around growth. School infrastructure, transport infrastructure are going to be key questions there. And I think Labor will really be hoping for a strong performance in both of those, particularly if they can replicate the enormous swing that happened overlaying the Riverstone electorate at the federal election.
Yeah, how did that go? Just briefly.
Yeah, look, it's mainly overlaid by Greenway, which is the seat held by Michelle Rowland. And from our estimations and approximations, if they are able to replicate that at booth by booth level in the Riverstone electorate, they're looking at a swing of 10%, which will secure them the seat fairly easily.
Okay, so Rhonda, that goes to the point of some analysis we did of Greenway before the federal election, which found it is a very, very highly concentrated area of newly arrived migrants and professional, highly educated people moving into that space. What are the concerns, do you think, that are likely to bubble up for those people that are new into that space?
Yep, so I would say that we could anticipate that there'd be, really focused on amenity, what's available in their local area, and the various factors that contribute to good quality of life. And again, just kind of back into some of our conversations around, social and hard infrastructure, connectivity with the rest of Sydney, and also, ensuring that they have access to the right infrastructures to continue to travel throughout the region and, for employment and different opportunities.
Okay. So now we're heading a little bit further south-west, Tom, I've got the geography right. East Hills and Holsworthy. East Hills just got itself a brand new hospital commitment, right?
Yeah.
But I can't find anything in the papers about it.
Look,
what's happening there?
It's an interesting thing. The element of timing for that announcement, of course, would have been a bit pragmatic. But we've heard, through Wendy Lindsay's Facebook page, no less, that East Hills will be the electorate that the new Bankstown Hospital is located in. No doubt that will be welcomed.
Why isn't that news more widespread, do you think, for the Liberals?
Look, I think that's a really good question. If I was in their shoes, given the marginality of the electorate, I think it's a good news story that no doubt they'll be wanting to share and really wanting to permeate the narrative about, the health infrastructure that's accessible to residents and constituents.
Okay, well, we'll hope to see more about that, but it's very difficult to find any information about that commitment through official sources. That's a tight electorate, of course, held by Wendy Lindsay.
Yep,
right?
yep, that's right. Very tight, very tight. And of course, Labor will fancy their chances there. But given we've seen a lot of movement into East Hills, particularly families who are moving into the Georges River kind of waterfront property, the demographics changing.
So again, like Greenway, like the example of Riverstone at the state level, it's a rapidly changed community and very diverse community again,
Yeah,
which is a
and
wonderful thing.
The interesting thing about East Hills is it's a tale of, I guess, two towns, if you will. The north is very working class, very, rusted on, has lived there a long time and a Labor. Traditionally, in terms of their voting patterns, but more and more the south of East Hills, that waterfront kind of property vibe, that's really moved towards, I guess, more affluent people who are tending to vote Liberal at elections.
All right, now it's an emotional moment. We are getting towards the end of this in-depth analysis. I am sorry, but we may do some more if the feedback is good or bad. But Holsworthy. Now, I don't know about you. I don't wake up in the middle of the night screaming Holsworthy's the answer, or I know very little about it. Take us through it.
Yeah, it's an electorate that's changed. I mean, if we talk about the shifting sands of the redistribution, Holsworthy is a great example. It's now expanded. It's dropped Casula and bits of Casula, so it's cut that off from the west. But it's picked up bits of Menai. And so that's drastically changed the voting profile and has led to a nominal redistribution where the Liberal Party went from a 3% margin to a 6% margin.
Okay, now this was previously held by, was it?
Melanie Gibbons.
Melanie Gibbons, that's right, who was potentially making a shift to the federal parliament. That didn't quite come off.
And she was ousted in pre-selection by Tina Ayad, who's a former councillor from Liverpool.
Oh, okay, all right. That's starting to come together now. And we also have, not in the marginal tent, but nearby, we have Liverpool, which is being contested by Karishma Kalyanda, previous Labor candidate. Okay.
Yep.
All right, so there's been a little bit of movement in some of these seats for Labor in terms of candidacy. Do you want to quickly touch on that?
Yeah, definitely. And for me, there's still a lot of movement to go. We've only just finalised the candidates for Labor in Cabramatta and in Fairfield, as I alluded to.
What about the Frank Carbone question?
Ooh,
are we going to see some movement there?
It is the big question. I mean, there's been rumblings of him running at the state election since Daly got up federally and showed that an independent can make inroads in Western Sydney. And remains to be seen if he'll put his hat in the ring at the last minute.
I can't leave you out of the controversy, Rhonda. Are we seeing a little independent revolution in southwestern Sydney on the back of Daly federally, the potential candidacy of Frank Carbone? Is southwestern Sydney going to become a little pocket of independent representatives?
Look, it might. I think that what we are seeing, kind of linking back to some of our earlier discussions in this session, is a growing appetite for representation from the region
At the local level.
the local level, to a kind of marrying up with the higher levels of distrust in government that might be contributing to this trend, but also really a growing sense of self-determination in communities in Western Sydney, and couple that with higher rates of education, higher income levels, and a growth in employment in the knowledge economy. I think that the political consciousness and engagement of residents of Western Sydney is then therefore being reflected in potentially more independents being voted in.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned that about an increasingly educated population, because I think it's been a mistake. I'm going to put on my political analyst hat at the moment. It's been a bit of a mistake on the part of both majors to play some sort of fringe or extremist views in narrow casting to those electorates. I think they deserve much more respect in terms of political dialogue. And is that potentially also a factor in the drift away from majors down there?
Yeah, I think that, coupled with those higher levels of distrust that we discussed, I think that there is, a real need for genuine engagement with communities. And like you said, that respect to ask communities what they desire, what they need, and to ensure those voices are heard. And I think that what we're seeing is when people's voices aren't being heard, there's a frustration, and people will take action based on that. And that, it is time to hear the voices and reflect the needs of our communities in Western Sydney.
Yeah, agreed. Look, and that's going to be a really interesting one to watch. I've got to leave the southwest. I'm sorry, I know we could say much more. It is your heartland as a Liverpool boy. But let's go out to Penrith. It always hurts me to say Penrith, the word Penrith, as a Parramatta fan, as a result of last year's grand final. But the P word, Penrith. Now, Penrith is a bit of a kind of trip back in time. These guys are going to vote like it's 1999, right, at this election. It's old school stuff. Take us through it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one because it's on a knife edge after the redistribution. We've got a very popular local candidate, Stuart Ayres. We've got a very popular local councillor and former mayor, Karen McKeon. It's up for grabs. And for me, Penrith's a really interesting one because I think about cost of living in Western Sydney, and Penrith ticks all those boxes as being one of the epicentres of the struggle. It's hotter than anywhere else, which means they're paying more for cooling their homes. It's further away in terms of toll roads than anywhere else, apart from maybe the MacArthur. And in terms of local employment, their corridors are out to the Hawkesbury, through to Blacktown St Mary's and the industrial there, or down the Northern Road to MacArthur, as well as the rest of the city, obviously.
It's got it all, Tom. Is that what you're saying?
It's got it all. So for me, I feel like out of every electorate, Penrith is the one where cost of living will be the thing that drives votes.
But we saw a surge, back to my earlier point around it being somewhat different from the Western Sydney. We saw a surge at the federal election against all of the swings the other way towards the Liberals. And they had a very strong candidate there, of course, Melissa McIntosh.
Yeah, and Melissa McIntosh, and back to what you were talking about, Rhonda, she ran a street-by-street campaign. She
Very
was
local.
hyper-local. She focused on constituents' issues, and that really unlocked it. And I mean, Stuart Ayres, of course, it's publicised he's no longer part of the ministry now.
Was in exile,
he's in exile at the moment.
Okay.
However, for me, that frees him up in some ways to play that hyper-local game in a way he might not have been able to before.
All right, your colleague here said it, the word street by street. Is that the new politics of Western Sydney? Is it street by street, hyper-local?
Look, I'd say with the emergence of technologies, we might be able to employ those too, right? We might be able to be a bit more creative. But I think meaningful engagement, genuine engagement, and concern and care for our communities is the way forward. I don't think that people's voices can be ignored anymore. And I think that we are, even as a younger generation, more empowered, more aware of our rights, and more just more connected. And I think that government must engage in communities at that meaningful level. And when I say meaningful, it's, when we are thinking through policies to ensure we're engaging communities from the beginning, but also feeding back to the community and providing opportunities for input and feedback, because our policies should reflect the needs of those that we're meant to be serving.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really great note for us to wrap up. And in doing that, I think that we will see some surprises in this election. As much as I trust your trend analyses, and I do, probably to my own fault, I do think, and commiserations again to your wife, I think that we are going to see some of the things that you've spoken about, Rhonda, around the new politics that people want to see in Western Sydney come to the fore. And Tom, I don't know about you, I hope we do see some surprises, because it will confirm that this is an incredibly sophisticated electorate, a sophisticated region that demands a reciprocal level of respect and sophistication from their political representatives.
Definitely.
Gee, that was tough to get out. Okay, so that's it for us. We will come back after the election. You can't stop us. We still have some film left in the canister, I think. And we'll do a bit of a wrap-up as to what happened, the thrills and spills that occurred on the 25th. We are hopelessly biased, as I always say in this part of the world. We are on the side of Western Sydney, but we advocate for Western Sydney at the centre here through evidence and through rigorous research, and we do that with and for our region. Rhonda has a vitally important role in developing that and pushing that further, as does Tom. You may have seen his gambling report, a real showstopper, but that's what we're about. And so thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you after the 25th. Bye-bye.